Welcome everybody to the Farmland Access Hub Collective Models Working Group and SARE Equitable 10-year cohort combined group webinar. We're a combined group now. We're bringing efforts together to continue this work. So I'm Gary Hampton. I've been working with Valentine on this Sarah project, and also I work with Renewing the Countryside.
Good to see you all. Yeah, so I'm Kristin King-Ries, and my pronouns are she, her. I live in Missoula, Montana, and I am not a farmer, and I'm a community gardener, and and I'm an attorney, and the bulk of my work is community land trust and affordable housing projects. Um, but because of Agrarian Trust and the Vermont Law School's Center for Ag and Food Systems, I get to work with farmers and on some farm projects. And those really are exciting to me and kind of speak to the core of what community equity can be all about, because it can be not just where you live, but where you work and how you interact with the economy and with the community. And I'm not seeing my slides yet. There we go. So I have to just apologize. This comes out of this is a presentation that I used recently for the American Planning Association and for their lawyers division. So it's pretty housing focused, but I tried to add in some stuff about farms, and I have some resources that I just want to tell you about, and I can share later. They're not in the slide deck, but I can share them with the group that are much more farm geared. But from what I understand, what I'm been asked to do is kind of talk about the legal mechanisms of how this can work. And so those are really more easily explained in the housing context, and you can see how they do and don't apply in farming. So first of all, I need to thank Greg Rosenberg and John Emmaus Davis for their generous input and assistance on this presentation. Greg's the executive director of what is now called the International CLT Center. John Davis is a renowned CLT expert and author who helped establish Champlain Housing Trust and is the co-president of the board for that center for CLT, the International Center for CLT. Community involvement and community agency at every level of governance in a community land trust is at the heart of the model and the reason for its success as a tool for racial and economic justice. It cannot be overstressed that the C has to come first in CLT. Thanks for the opportunity to share some things I've learned about the model and to then learn from you how CLTs can more effectively work for farmers in their communities. The resources I want to share with you are check out the Land Trust for Urban Farms on International Center for CLT's website. Some of these urban CLT farms include Dudley Street Neighbors in Boston, the Athens CLT in Athens, Georgia, Troy Gardens, which is in Wisconsin, the Southside CLT in Rhode Island, and Sawmill CLT in New Mexico. For rural farming using shared equity, I would just say look at Agrarian Trust's website and also the Vermont Law School's CAF's website, which I mentioned earlier. As Fran may have said, I had to leave early, so I didn't catch all of Fran's talk last week. But Agrarian Trust is we're learning as we go how to use this model for farms and farmlands and how to figure out best ways for a national organization to support local organizations. And as Gary was saying when I got on the call earlier, we're just learning as we go, you know. So I unfortunately don't have answers. I have more questions than answers, but um, a couple other things to look at in terms of farming and equity or shared equity models. Central Virginia Agrarian Commons is an excellent example of what you can do with community-owned land and the Happily Natural Farm, and that's Duran Chavis's work and his community. Equity Trust in the Northeast uses something called option to purchase at agricultural value. These are a kind of easement, I guess, that some places, some states in the Northeast allow, and those are helpful for getting access to farmland without having to pay market value. It doesn't really apply in the rest of the country. And then finally, a lot of people look at conservation easements as a way to acquire farmland and get money to acquire farmland and then put it into community ownership. One thing I would just kind of give you a heads up about conservation easements is you may need to make sure that there is no um, if that they allow for the separation of land and improvements, land from improvements, because it turns out that a lot of conservation easements say it, you know, you cannot, in the building envelope, you can't separate the land from the improvements. So basically only one person or entity can own the land and the improvements together. So there's no way for a nonprofit to have that land and sell the home to a farmer. Okay, next slide, please. New communities. So the community land trust model has mostly been used in this country in cities and in developed areas for affordable housing, but it started in farming. Often called the first CLT, New Communities was an outgrowth of the civil rights movement that unfolded in Albany, Georgia in the 1960s. These leaders hope to establish a form of land tenure to secure greater economic and political independence for African American farmers and their families who are being forced off the land by mechanization but also primarily in retaliation for registering to vote. In mid-1969, the bylaws were drafted by C.B. King, who was a lawyer who was a cousin of Martin Luther King Jr., and the bylaws stated that it was a nonprofit organization to hold land in perpetual trust for the permanent use of rural communities. So this was a brand new model of land tenure in this country and very exciting one. The organization acquired 5,000 acres. Over 15 years, they raised and sold agricultural products, corn, peanuts, soybeans, watermelon, hay, and beef. Several families moved into the buildings that existed on the land prior to purchase, and they owned these buildings. But New Communities was never able to develop the two planned residential communities that they had envisioned. The economic risks of farming, crushing debt on the land, successive years of drought, and discriminatory lending by the Farmers Home Administration all made it harder and harder for New Communities to hang on to its land. They were forced to sell much of the acreage in the early 1980s, and then the rest was lost to foreclosure. However, the story goes on, and New Communities still exists today and still owns land, and they are using it in a different way. But if you go, you can find their story online and learn kind of about some of the really innovative things that they've done. Next slide, please. So in terms of legal tools for creating permanent affordability, these already exist. There's no need for legislation. Let's see, the basic legal tools that have allowed CLTs to operate in the US for over 50 years. I'm just going to talk about briefly how they work. And then I'll give an overview of some recent statutes, policies, and practices at the federal, state, and local level that are helping community land trusts not only exist, but thrive. Next slide, please. Here's an example of how the community land trust model can work. A CLT will get property with a house through a purchase or donation. Let's say the value is 400,000, 200,000 for land, 200,000 for the house. At the time of sale, the company creates two separate parcels for real estate, one for land and one for home. The CLT sells just the home parcel to a buyer for 200,000 using a deed of trust. The CLT keeps the deed to the land and leases the land under the home for a nominal amount, typically between $50 and $100 a month. In exchange for the lower purchase price and to ensure ongoing affordability, the homeowner signs a ground lease agreement that agrees to certain restrictions. So it's like owning real estate, but there are these restrictions. You have to sell to another income qualified buyer. So it's a pay it forward model. And this is something that we've been working on with Agrarian Trust, trying to figure out, in an urban CLT setting, the way that kind of decide who is going to buy into the community land trust is based on somebody's income. There, but with farming, it's tricky, and people are trying to figure out how does a farmer qualify for benefits from a nonprofit if they aren't if it's not done strictly by using their income, and that's sort of a work in progress that we'll see how that goes. Ideally, a farming CLT would be able to have somebody buy in because they are a farmer and they want to farm. Let's see. What else? Oh, you have to use the home as a primary residence, and you have to limit the return on investment when you resell. You can still build equity in this way, even though it feels like you wouldn't be able to, because you have a mortgage and you would realize a percentage of the profit at sale. What the CLT has just done in this example, using existing laws, is to make a $400,000 house available to a qualified buyer for $200,000. So it's an oversimplification, but you get the idea. In the hypothetical, the property came with a home. A lot of times CLTs will get unimproved property and develop buildings on it. And in that scenario, you could build barns. There could be other types of infrastructure on a farm that would serve the same role. So is anyone on, next slide, please. I guess I don't have a sense of the audience. So does anyone here have questions about how the legal tools work? Do people want to get into that? Because that's really what my slides are. The next several slides are just about, okay, here's how real property works. Here's how finance works. Here's how taxes work. How can you operate a community land trust based on, using these existing laws. So I can't really see what the comments, they're just, so can somebody?
There seems to be the feedback is saying yes. They're seeking what you're speaking to.
Okay.
So is how to utilize, put it to use.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I just didn't want to just go on about something that was of no interest. A lot of times, when you talk about the law, people's eyes glaze over. So, okay. Is it legal to separate land from improvements? Yes. Short answer. Property rights are broader than fee simple. What I thought of as a kid, as property rights was, oh, you own a piece of land, then you own everything associated with it, to the extent that I gave it any thought at all. But it turns out that there are what they call a bundle of rights connected to the same physical place. These can be sold together or they can be separated out. So examples of this are mineral rights, water rights, airspace rights, easements, which are use of land but not ownership of land, and then land, of course, itself, the ground, and buildings. Um, Other examples of horizontal separation that people are pretty familiar with are, for example, long-term commercial ground leases, where a landlord leases unbuilt property, unimproved, just a lot, and then they say that they will build to suit for the tenant. The tenant um, gets title to the building, so they pay for and own the building on top of the land, whereas the landlord continues to own the land under it. And then the relationship between the two parties is governed by this lease. And the commercial ground lease is where CLT lawyers kind of got the idea for the CLT ground lease. This is how it evolved. Another example are mobile home parks, where a home is affixed to the land. So in that case, the taxing authority will tax, we'll create two separate parcels and they'll tax the home separately from the land. Yeah, so one party owns the home, the other one owns the land, and then there's this lease between the two parties. Condominiums are also considered real property, even though in many cases, all they are is the airspace between the walls, and every other element belongs to the HOA. So in this way, a CLT is no different. And some of the things that we've thought of with agrarian trust are like, what about solar farms? What about carbon sequestration? Like, are there some other types of improvements that can be on the land that can be owned by farmers and help them build their equity, and that aren't homes? And the answer is yes, this can happen. The big problem, like the driver here, is lending. The lenders won't lend you. You can't get a mortgage on a solar farm, So this is tricky. And there are a lot of organizations, sort of new economy organizations, working on coming up with answers for these financial issues, revolving loan funds, other ways for people to be able to purchase things besides homes and build equity in them. But this is a work in progress right now. So they're exciting, really exciting ideas, creative ideas, but we haven't figured it out yet. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. What about the restrictions in the ground lease? Are these legal? So in the case of farmers, this is a big one. Okay, this is if you have a nonprofit, the nonprofit has to be mission oriented. It has to follow its mission, and it can't give private benefit to, it can't give benefit to an individual or a group of individuals unless they are completely a mission fit. And that mission group, the group that you're serving, has to be considered eligible for, for these benefits. So income is an easy one. And that's what CLTs have been doing for decades, is saying, okay, if in order to be a home buyer in this project and a member of our community land trust, you have to be at 80% of the area median income. But with farms, people are wanting to say, well, they're farmers. That's their qualification. That hasn't gotten worked out yet. But as to the other restrictions in the ground lease, for example, like saying you have to live there a certain number of months of the year, saying that you can't use it as an Airbnb, other things like that. those are completely legal. A lease is negotiated, and the lease terms, as long as they're agreed to by both parties, typically are not going to get questioned. The buyout price, for example, like a restricted buyout price for the improvements or infrastructure, is freely and mutually agreed to. And often the CLTs will have their buyers consult with an independent attorney just so that everybody is clear that, you know, the buyer knew what they were getting, they knew what they weren't getting, they're not being tricked. And this is something that they agreed to. And not only agreed to, but they support the mission. Also, courts have looked at the fact that these restrictions protect public and private subsidies by maintaining the affordability going forward. And we do this all the time in other contexts. We put on restrictions. For example, HOAs have all kinds of restrictions that they impose on home ownership, and the courts generally hold these to be reasonable. Next slide. So at this point, there are community land trusts in, I believe, 48 states. It's hard to know exactly, changes all the time, but they're pretty much all across the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii have them. And all of these are, you know, have been created relying on a combination of existing state, local, and federal laws to both organize and operate. That said, CLTs are finding that legislation can be very helpful. They may not need it to survive, but they appreciate how it can help them thrive. And if you don't already have laws on the books in your state that govern CLT organizations and operations, you soon may. Increasingly, governments are recognizing the community land trust model as an important component of affordable housing strategy. And there is a growing awareness of how the model can help provide access to farmland as well as for those facing barriers to home ownership. However, there's a much more going on in the context of home ownership than in the context of shared equity farm ownership. And I think if you're interested, there are CLT coalitions in different, there's one, there's a big one in California, there's one in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, that's a 5-state group. There's the Minnesota Home Coalition, which is a really strong one. There's, you know, a number of these organizations. And those, if you're interested as farmers in getting, you know, having some of the benefits of these laws and getting farms put into this as a consideration, then I would strongly recommend that you, excuse me, reach out. I have allergies. That you reach out to them. California in particular is doing some really exciting things with CLTs and farms. There are a handful of agricultural CLTs there, and I went to their conference last fall, and there definitely is growing interest in farm worker housing, farm worker autonomy, and excuse me. Okay, so next slide, please. There's almost nothing at the federal level. There are a couple of things. One, there is a definition of a community land trust in the U.S. Code that was passed in 1992. It's still there. It's still on the books, but it's hard to find. It gets hidden under a bunch of other regulations. But it's good to know that it's there because you can tell people, you know, if they say, well, what is this thing? It's not, doesn't sound legit, sounds made up. You know, you can point to the 42 USC and that seems to give people comfort. The other piece of federal policy that's out there is that both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the lending agencies, they both have community land trust riders now, so they have a process for working with community land trust home buyers and homes, and that has made a huge difference in terms of access to lending. Okay, next slide, please. I don't know if anyone else is having early spring and allergies right now, but this is the earliest spring I think I've had here in Montana. Okay, some state legislative support that you might think about, you know, advocating for farming. State housing trust funds, special funding allocations, defining and enabling acts. So defining community land trusts and enabling acts that say, this is what community land trusts can do legally. Um, I would say getting farms in there is really important. And in fact, speaking of California, their community land trust definition, which was passed in 2016, just says housing. It's limited to housing. And so the CLT network there is advocating for that definition to be changed to include commercial buildings, um, and urban farms, gardens, open space, and farming. Let's see, standards for tax assessment. I mean, this is a huge one. Making sure that if you are only getting limited value, like if you're having limited resale value on something that you own, you should not be taxed on the market value, because you're not getting the market value. So CLTs are working hard to make sure that taxing authorities at the state level and also at the local level, and the tax assessors themselves, make sure they understand the limits of what you have purchased and tax you only on that. The last one is land banking. Excuse me. States and government agencies own a ton of land. And so community land trusts are working on having policies where state-owned land, where nonprofits get a crack at buying state-owned land, or get some state-owned land donated, or have it sold at a reduced price if it's going to be used for access to farmland or affordable housing. Okay, next one. Finally, local support. These are some things that are not regulatory, but can be really helpful. Donations of land, again, from from the smaller governmental agencies or entities. Getting grants and low interest loans for projects, and grants for operations. And I think any of you who've done work with nonprofits are familiar with the fact that it's typically easier to get money for projects. People are more interested in funding projects or purchases of land. Those are sexier, but that the operations which make all those things happen are harder to get funded. So advocating for those kinds of resources make a lot of sense. Okay, last slide, please. Keeping the C in CLT. We all know that as farmers in this country age and their descendants are not following in their footsteps, a huge amount of farmland is changing hands. Putting land into community ownership can be a powerful tool for protecting farmland and making it accessible to low and moderate income farmers and other farmers facing barriers to access. As you tackle these issues, remember to center the community of individuals that you work for and with. They are your critical partner every step of the way. Make sure that their voices are heard. The community land trust model succeeds for farmers in places where the organization, which includes members, staff, and board, is made up of people who live in and represent the needs of the community, people with expertise in relevant subject, and people who own CLT improvements, where the homeowners or farmers refer to the CLT as we instead of they, and where categories of community member, expert, and homeowner overlap. It means homeowners and farmer lessees make up at least 1/3 of the board. While CLT staff handle day-to-day operations, it's the community members and board members who guard the mission and keep an open line of communication. um, so that's my spiel. And then I have some resources as part of the slide deck, but as I said, I will send some more farm appropriate ones after this call. Thank you for listening, and I would really love to hear input and questions.
Yes, Kristin. There are a couple of questions or some thoughts in the chat, and I pulled a few out to help guide the conversation with you. When it comes to the restricted equity sales, does that hold up to scrutiny in legal processes that consider a person's assets in relation to market value? And then I'm assuming that the restricted equity value sales are not equal to market values.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So let's see. The way it works is when a person purchases a CLT home, they know ahead of time what formula or percentage that the community land trust uses for their pre-sales. So in the past, it was often like an appraisal based formula. So it'd be like at time of sale, you get 25% of the market rate value of your home. So that would be how it would be capped. So you would get whatever amount you put into your mortgage. Um, you get back that amount plus this 25%. As the market has just gone insane, the 25% they're finding is unsustainable, because if the person owning the home gets 25% of the market value and the market value's gone up 400% over the 10 years that they've owned the home, then it's not going to be affordable for the next family going in. So now a lot of community land trusts have gone to a flat percentage rate, and it's significantly lower. Is it considered legal? It is considered legal just because it's freely agreed to, and it's like, I'm trying to think of an equivalent, but that's what you're buying. You're paying significantly below the market rate to get into the home in the first place. Again, in the past, your CLT home might have been 25% less than the market rate for purchasing. Now, a CLT home in some places is going to be 75% lower at purchase than the market rate. If your neighbor might pay 600,000 and you might pay 200,000 because of all the subsidy that goes into the home to begin with. And so it's just it's been considered basically a fair exchange. And what's really, CLTs have not been there's almost no case law. In fact, I have never found a case that concerns a community land trust or any aspect of the ground lease or anything else. And so, it's been kind of flying under the radar, and I'm a little bit dreading now that CLTs have hit kind of a tipping point, and there's a huge explosion of growth in that area. I'm a little worried about what courts will do with it. But yeah, so far, not a problem. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? If you have any questions and don't want to ask, just drop it into the chat. Go ahead, Robin.
I have another. This is related, but not on the same vein. So, one of the things I know is just how hard it because of the way that housing prices have skyrocketed. We're considering doing that out here, and one of the concerns is if we need to leave, if we can no longer live in these rural properties, we wouldn't have enough equity to enter any other kind of housing situation. Is that being addressed in any way in this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, in the past, and I mean, as recent as 2018, the numbers, the stats were that 6 out of 10 community land trust homeowners were able to did transition into market rate housing because, they were able to save up the money. So if you were paying $1,000 in rent, or let's say whatever, $2,000 in rent a month, if you're renting, you never see that money again. If you own, that money goes, to pay down your mortgage. And so you see some, a fair amount of that money come back to you. So just that by itself makes a huge difference for people. And then on top of that, whatever equity that you get to realize, whatever growth, you get to realize during the time that you own that home. And that was enough, people found, to move into the market, and buy a fee simple home. Um, and 6 out of 10 was not, that was people who wanted to move. So I think there was probably even a higher number that could have moved into market rate, but a lot of people get into these communities and they love them and they want to stay. So now I have no idea. In the last few years, everything is completely, it's just hard to say. And I dread seeing those numbers in 5 years because I think it has changed significantly. Um, that said, there is still that benefit of whatever rent you're paying, you know, is not rent. Whatever you're paying into your mortgage is equity that you're building. So, well, and the other thing is that there's a lot more interest in cooperatives, cooperative housing instead of community land trust housing. So owning a share in a cooperative, and people are giving up equity growth for secure long-term tenure and control over where you're living. So, um, you know, if you are living in a rural property and you have to move out, you know, you can look at these limited equity co-ops or, other types of cooperative living arrangements.
Okay, there's another question. Is there a specific NAICIS tax code for community land trust? Thinking of starting one, and the designation is confusing to them.
Yeah, I hear you. Contact me separately and we can talk about taxes. I mean, no, a community land trust is just a 501(c)(3). That's the tax designation. Um, and then community land trust properties, what you have to do is get the taxing authority. So the Department of Revenue in your state has to recognize that they're two separate parcels, that the land belongs to one organization and the improvements belong to a different, to a person or family. Yeah, tax is a whole other world. Are there people who are interested in trying to do like solar panels or other ownership wind, yeah. So, to be determined. That is something there's such a huge amount of interest in. So I'm hopeful that the financing is going to get figured out, but really, I don't know. I'm interested. What's your experience in trying to do that? The Cindy Hale.
Yeah, so just really quick. So by trying to create a large scale solar array, it makes us ineligible for the federal REAP program, which funds farm-based solar, because there's a cap on how big that system can be. It can only be at 120% of your need. Our need's super low. We can generate 5 megawatts on our farm, and there's not much in between. Like, how do we get to be able to maximize that? And for those in the Midwest region, I'll just put a plug out to Compeer, which is a Midwest regional farm financing organization. They have recently implemented 100% financing lease program for farmers. So they will basically pay to install it. You enter into a lease agreement, and then the revenues from that solar array go to pay off that lease. And then at the end of the lease, 10 or 15 years, you own it. So for those in the Midwest who might be in a position to do something like that, talk to Compeer.
Great. And so, but it sounds like that the people who own the solar are also owning the land. Is that right? You're not
At this point, although our township is super interested in this community, like our township would love to just lease our land and build the solar array, but we don't even know where to start with the legal issues around that, because everybody's, unpaid volunteer coordinators. And so, figuring that out is just a really, really daunting task.
Oh, there is a law professor at the University of Michigan who is working on issues of like solar and wind farms, particularly in Michigan. But I think she's going to expand some of her work. If you email me after this, I will find her. I'm trying to Sarah. I can't remember her last name, but doing some really exciting work on that front. So.
Yes. I'll bring forth another question in the chat just to continue. In areas that community land trusts are the only affordable housing option for Black and Brown folks, and government has largely incubated the land trust model. The land trust is looked at as a racist, sharecropping like model. What are your thoughts? And Valentine as well has posted a response to that one as well. But if you could give your thoughts around that.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, I think that's valid. And what are my thoughts? I mean, okay. First of all, nobody should have to buy into it. It is voluntary, but where a community land trust this is why I'm saying it needs to be community run and community just community focused. And there are a number of land trusts that are not really that way, where you have a white-led organization in a Black or Brown community. It's a problem. And there are organizations, like Grounded Solutions Network is trying to work on issues of race in the community land trust movement. But just like all nonprofits, I think it is a huge problem. And I can see why people who've had barriers to access all along, who've been discriminated against in all these different ways, why this, when somebody comes to you and says, well, here's your only opportunity for owning, and it has all these restrictions and limitations, why you'd be like, well, no thanks. That doesn't appeal to me. And I think you have to look at the people, if you're looking at buying in, you have to look at, am I really represented? Are there is there a third of the board that's homeowners? Is there representation of the community on the staff? And, are our considerations and interests being taken into account when projects are developed? And so, and then if the answer is yes, I feel represented, and I feel like I can, get my needs met and my voice heard, then you look at, okay, I'm not going to have the full value, but is this better than renting forever? Is this a midway point where instead of having to constantly pay rent and never grow any equity, is this a way for me to get some money together and then, make a different plan? But like I said, right now, it's hard because the markets are so crazy. But if you live in a place with a community land trust and you have the bandwidth to get involved, I would encourage you to do that, and to say, to challenge folks who are running these community land trusts and say, look, if you say you're representing the community, I'm part of the community, and I want to be heard. I want to be involved. But, that's also a big ask. And so, yeah, I mean, when I first learned about the model, I thought, oh, this is amazing. And where has this been all my life? And I'm still a big proponent of it. But I also, the longer I work in this area, the more, the more issues I see with it.
I just want to add on to that without having to add to the chat. So our community land trust in Delray Beach, Florida, was created by the city, essentially, through the Community Redevelopment Agency, the CRA. And ultimately, the CRA incubated a nonprofit agency as a CLT that took out other community-based nonprofits that were focusing on housing. And as also a response to, so the CRA obviously is a major land banker, land taker, and eminent domainer. Right. And so to essentially robbed the community of land by forcing folks out over years, Black and Brown owned land. And then as a response created a nonprofit using the CLT model to, and why I say the sharecropping, use of this land is that it was taken from Black and Brown folks over years and then leased back to them, essentially, for homes. And so in our community, like, we have a really hard time, like our Black and Brown community specifically is very anti-community land trust, even though it is really one of the only options now for affordability in the place where we were restricted to as Black and Brown folks to live.
Right.
So I think that it's really hard to overcome that. Obviously, like, it was used against this community. And then it became this whole mainstream way of access to housing affordably.
Yeah, that is truly messed up.
Thanks.
So there's a couple folks doing some really great work on that front. Professor Sheila Foster, who's at Georgetown, but she's visiting in Columbia right now. She and then two other professors are working. They're doing something called a Co-Cities project in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is really, I just learned about it about a month ago. So, and I can't really say that I can explain it, but Professor Foster is an African American woman, and she really has looked at all these issues with community land trusts, but also still thinks that that the model is worth holding on to. So that might be something, her work is something you might want to look at, but also look at the Co-Cities project in Baton Rouge, which is it's basically like, okay, every part of our community is going to get listened to and paid attention to when we create our housing in this city. We're going to look at access to technology, access to energy. We're going to look at climate challenges with climate change and the way that they're, disproportionately impacting people of color. And, there's some really exciting work happening there, but honestly, yeah, there's just still that is so wrong in terms of how housing is dealt with, even with models that are, ideally really progressive. And like I said, this model came out of a group of civil rights activists. This was something that they were putting together to counteract sharecropping, to counteract the kinds of racist, the discrimination that they've been facing. So it makes me sick, heart sick, when I hear about things like that, like Delray, where, yeah. And thanks for sharing that, because I'm writing a chapter right now on state laws and community land trusts. And Florida has had community land trust laws on the books probably longer than most places. And it's such a mix of, it seems like it has had very mixed results.
Just to add one more thought to that around, what you're writing about, I think in Florida, it's important to definitely note that like land trusts have been incubated by governments, agencies even, and that they're concentrated in Black neighborhoods specifically, like segregated Black neighborhoods. Okay. So like where land was easy to come by cheaper when they started, basically when the government started being interested at all in the development of those areas. And so yeah, I do think that, if you want to chat more about that, I'm open to that.
Yeah,
we got it. Unfortunately, it's really one of those things that it's hard to convince Black folks down in our areas that in like the urban areas, so like in the cities, basically in the neighborhoods specifically where Black and brown folks had to live, that is the model that was the response by the government for like affordable housing, but really land that they own. So they're like pipelining land specifically that they took and giving it back to folks, but they're leasing it. So right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That's something. Please email me.
Yeah, will do.
Yeah.
Katie or Valentine, do y'all want to pick up on any portion of this?
Sure. Yeah. I also just wanted to say that we had scheduled today for an hour and a half, but we totally recognize that some people can only stay for an hour. So feel free to hop off as you need to, and we'll share the recording of the rest of the whole thing with everyone. I wanted to pick up Evie's comment about like whether anyone has seen this model used as a land back, like thinking about sovereignty. And I'll just say I had said in the chat, especially against the kind of model that's being abused. And I haven't heard from them since COVID, so I don't know how this is going. But we in the Twin Cities had been doing a lot of study with the cooperative community of West Jackson. That was it was buying up land that was in the path of gentrification. Like I think it was kind of a situation where they were afraid the government was going to do that kind of work. And so they were a community land trust that was buying land out from slumlords and doing a lot of work rehabilitating housing, basically keeping the same people living in the houses, but building up more paths to ownership and community development. And the Land Trust Alliance, or Land Access Alliance in northern Minnesota has been using a CLT model to try to build Indigenous access to treaty lands that where usufruct rights have not been respected. And I'm curious, Kristin, if you know if there are other or kind of like a larger coalition or tendency of using this kind of model for that sovereignty building.
Yeah. So kind of on the fringes, I would say. Douglas CLT in Washington, D.C. is doing something similar to what you mentioned that Jackson is doing, where there was a pedestrian bridge that was put in across the river, and it connected, a very affluent white neighborhood to an economically depressed African American neighborhood, and so the folks in the African American neighborhood saw it coming and said, we need to get on this and try to get ahead of it. So that is definitely something that's happening, is, acquisition, trying to make sure that land gets purchased for the community and used by the community and stays that way. Again, in Baton Rouge, I think that Co-Cities project, there's a lot of that happening as well. And then, in terms of like land back for tribes, I run into it in other areas, conservation land trusts that are trying to do some of that work. There was a land trust in Maine that purchased like 300 acres of tribal land, or land that had been tribal land that was sacred to the tribe, that was coming up for sale, and they purchased it, put an easement on it, and gave the land back to the tribe. But that is pretty unusual in my experience. The other thing that's happening on the fringes is something called the tenant ownership, or no, what is it? Tenant Option to Purchase Acts. Have people heard about those? TOPA and COPA. And what that is where, what community land trusts are trying to do in that space is buy a building and then offer tenants the opportunity to own their units, to purchase their units. When there are, landlords that are charging exorbitant rents, or if a building is being threatened with foreclosure and all the people would be displaced, there's private projects happening in New York and California, for example, where that's, where CLTs are buying those properties and then kind of giving tenants the time to organize and either come into create a cooperative and own the whole property themselves, or own the units as condominiums and be, CLT condo owners. I just saw somebody posted something about bylaws. Yeah, this is an open share area, and I'm happy to share sample bylaws with folks on things like that. But the TOPA and COPA people are working on legislation where that, where cities and other, governmental entities would have to give right of first refusal for tenants if their building was being threatened. So, yeah. Yeah, but land back is people, there's a lot of talk and I don't see a lot of action yet.
Folks, feel free to also speak your questions, but I saw Kristin had also asked a question about whether we had talked about permanent real estate cooperatives or permanent real estate efforts. And I have also been curious how that relates to CLTs.
Permanent real estate co-ops?
Yeah, so like I know I've heard a lot about the East Bay permanent real estate effort, for example.
Okay. I guess people just use different terms for it, but a cooperative model is different from a CLT model, but they're both shared equity. The difference is that the cooperative is entirely like it's not there's no ownership by a separate nonprofit. The co-op members own the land and the building typically, and then they own a share of, like, they own a right to live in a unit. Co-ops and CLTs have been collaborating some to make it easier to take some of the cost out of ownership for the co-ops. So where CLTs will buy the land. And I think that, is that the East Bay model that you're thinking of?
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, so, right, so then a community land trust will own the land, and then the tenant, the folks who live in the building have, are become a cooperative, which is not a nonprofit, it's its own type of legal entity, and they own everything in common, and they govern in common, and rather than owning like a piece of something, they own a share. So your share entitles you to live in a unit typically. And then, everybody pools together to pay for all of the improvement, everything, all the upkeep, maintenance, taxes, and so on. And a co-op model is a fantastic model, but it requires a lot of time and participation, and it's really, you have to, it's a huge learning curve because you're running a company essentially, and that you're not just living somewhere, you're working with a group of people, and as a group you are running a company. So you don't just go home at night and watch TV and it's I mean, I think, and there are people for whom it is a great model, and there are people who want nothing to do with it because they just don't want to have to. There's, living with human beings, there's always conflict, and so being a part of a cooperative, you're constantly having to negotiate all of these different people's interests and needs and try to come up with a solution that works for everybody.
People in the Midwest are also going to hate me for mentioning this, but I feel obligated to because this is about shared farmland. And in the 7 states that still have restrictions on the corporate ownership of farmland, co-ops are one of the corporate forms of farmland. So I just feel like it's worth noting because a lot of effort has been wasted going through the really rigorous and often awesome efforts to come up with that like flatter hierarchy and shared governance, and then it's not in compliance and people aren't able to hold that for farming. So that brings me back, and there have been a couple questions in the chat about this. Could you say a little bit more about the efforts to get agriculture named in community land trust legislation? Because I've noticed this. So it appears that CLTs tend to be legislated, aside from those two pieces of legislation you mentioned, they tend to be legislated at the state level. So like I'm in Minnesota. Minnesota has a statute that says the CLT is a nonprofit that fundamentally is for housing, for affordable housing. But it does mention that there are some like other ancillary things having to do with affordable housing. So we've been trying to make a case that every community that wants affordable housing also needs to have affordable food in the community, and that food land and housing land should be treated together. So I would love to hear more of the efforts to get agriculture included under that umbrella, because that feels like a real action point for this.
Yeah, I would say to that end, it really is going to just come down to individuals showing up at these meetings. In your case, the Home Coalition, it's an acronym, I think, HOM. And Jeff Washburn is, I think, the president right now, and Jeff would be the guy to talk to. He's a huge legislative advocate for CLT housing, and I think he would be really open to hearing, I think in his case, or, in the case of a lot of CLTs and CLT advocacy groups, they're just it's not even on their radar. So you need to get in front of them and make your case. And just always, remind them that new communities was where it all began, and that farming is, of course, a natural application for community land trusts. Yeah, and there, like I said, if you're depending on where you are, there are going to be advocacy groups. If there are not, then I would say connect with Grounded Solutions Network too, which is the national organization. They really are not thinking about farmland right now, and I think that's worth working on. One thing I want to say before I forget, as I'm looking at Jean's beautiful face and remembering that Agrarian Trust is working hard on doing land back, and there are some projects in the works, and I know, and yeah, so there are people working very hard at it. It's just like anything else, it's just taking time. Yeah, did other people have questions about advocacy in their areas that I haven't covered, like places that I haven't talked about?
There is another question in the chat if no one has one. What are the opportunities and challenges in establishing a farming collective or co-op on a CLT? And do you think it would still be feasible to build equity? Do you think it would be still be feasible to build equity through improvements to the land, buildings, etc., when divided up between many people? I guess this comes back to the co-op and shared collective ownership as well.
Okay. Well, farm co-ops are not new. I mean, that's a use that people have, co-ops, there are a lot of agricultural co-ops, but the ownership, the shares typically in those are not in the improvements necessarily as much as they are in the business itself. So if you have a viable farm business that's doing well, you can create a cooperative and then have ownership, shares that different individuals own, and can build individual equity based on, the return from their shares. Some big ones, like, what is it? Gosh, there are a couple of huge organic co-ops. Oh shoot, I'm sorry, they just have gone right out of my head. Can anybody think of one right now?
The large organic co-ops like Organic Valley.
Oh, hi, Grace. I didn't know you were here. Yeah, Organic Valley, huge one. There's an egg one. Yeah, there are there's some examples where if you have a strong business model, Saffron, I don't know that one, then yeah, absolutely, you can use the co-op model and you can make a profit, you know, and yeah. The issue with co-ops, the question more is like with housing, are you gonna, I mean, yes, you can have a co-op that is very expensive. New York City has some of the most expensive real estate in the country in cooperatives. You know, there's some very exclusive co-op housing units. But if you're trying to use the co-op as a model for affordability and it's a limited equity co-op, then just by definition, no, you're not going to be building equity. You're just going to have secure long-term tenure and control over, you know, over your housing. Yeah, but I mean, you could, people are getting creative and, you know, I think I'm looking forward to 5 years from now, seeing all the different things that are out there. Passing. Somewhere in my computer, I have a list of these big ag co-ops if people are interested. And most states have a cooperative development corporation that receives some, I think it's federal money, but they can provide technical assistance. You know, there are some good resources that are helpful that don't cost a lot of money, or in some cases any money, when you're looking at the co-op model.
I see Holly just asked the question, can you talk more about the process of getting land back conversations going in Agrarian Trust and the broader land trust community? Any organizations or examples you would point to?
Well, Jean is here, so I think she would be the one to take that question.
You must have read my mind, whoever just asked that, because I was actually just typing in the chat because Kristin had mentioned that we're engaged in land back work, and so I wanted to share our collaboration with Baguaso, and this is an indigenous collective that we've been working with, the Baguaso Land Rematriation Project in Massachusetts, and it's just been a really healing and just very powerful collaboration. And so I put a link in the chat for folks to read more about it. And these are, you know, the words of the folks who are directly involved in this project on our site. And so you can read and hear from people themselves describing the project. And we just need to raise like 6.7% of the amount raised. We're almost to $1.8 million on this project. And so just really excited that we've been able to really use our position as a land trust to catalyze philanthropy and donations toward this project. And so we're really, really close, just about $100,000 left to go on this fundraiser. But we regularly collaborate with groups to facilitate reparations and land rematriation. And so we really see ourselves as a facilitator, as a catalyzer, you know, as a group that can connect smaller groups with that kind of philanthropic capital. You know, the reality is we shouldn't have to do this. We shouldn't have to have CLTs. We shouldn't have to exist, right? We don't want a nonprofit industrial complex. We don't want to have to do this work. But the reality is we're here in this very imperfect situation with imperfect legal tools that don't fully solve all of our problems and create the just, equitable society we want. And we're, you know, trying our best to do this work with integrity. And I think just acknowledging the limitations of a lot of the different models, as Kristin has, is really healthy place to be. You know, never claiming that one type of legal entity is going to solve our problem. And Kristin, I love how you say just putting community first at all times, right? That's our guiding star, and why we do what we do, and what really honestly gets us out of bed in the morning and makes us excited to do this work. It's really the communities we work with that is most inspiring, and despite the imperfections of the, the legal tools we have. So hopefully I didn't, sorry, I just got philosophical there. I know people wanted to just hear about the specific project, but I was just feeling inspired by your talk, Kristin. So thank you all. So I'll hand it back. I hope I answered the question.
Folks are sharing some great examples too in the chat. Part of what I would say I've also been really heartened by in the last, really just the last few months of this kind of work, is seeing a lot more discussion of like proper relinquishment, and especially for folks who are new to this conversation that we've been having in the upper Midwest, a lot of the conversation, like peer-to-peer support, has been about, and I've seen this with Northeast Farmers of Land Trust and their work with Agrarian Trust as well, that helping support well-meaning landholders past the kind of like flirting with the idea and feeling good about it stage, so that people don't lead, especially agriculturalists, on with the promise of land that they haven't really thought through or aren't really ready to act on, or that it's not like another patronizing sharecropping situation where it's like we want you on this land, but really we want you doing our projects, like really more like an employee, which is awfully common. So other questions people wanted to bring into this space? Just going back, there are a couple more specifics. I think one specific that I see in the chat that we haven't really discussed that much is, if you could say a little bit more, Kristin, in your work with CLTs, if you've seen kind of better or worse practices in terms of building up more. I think the phrase I would use is like power with rather than power over, because I feel like part of the challenge of adapting the CLT model to agriculture is that we don't yet have good ways to measure building equity in, say, soil or agricultural improvements of land. And all the models I've seen, there's a desire from the community to maximize the investment in the land, to be able to buy more land to get into the community. And that's always in tension with what the lease rates or the ownership rate is likely to be for that farm enterprise on the land. And I'm curious if you have come across examples of this that seem to be better.
Let me think. So you're saying, wait, can you rephrase that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm partly thinking about the kind of tensions that in agricultural law tend to get called, like, the like what's addressed in lender lessee kind of, or like, the mediations that often happen about like how much is this land going to cost, and I farmed on this land for 10 years, but I didn't own the land. Now that I'm selling my farm enterprise, how do I evaluate how much my contributions to that, like I put up fences, I put in irrigation, I built that soil for 10 years, how does that get evaluated? I realize this is like the cutting edge of what people are thinking about, but you're right in the middle of it, so I thought you might know something.
No, I'm thinking about it all the time. That isn't really, that we haven't yet figured that out. And I would say, like, in terms of best practices for bringing the community in on a like a community land trust front, it really is about making sure that you have regular meetings, that everybody's voice gets heard. And it's slow and it's frustrating, but I the only way I can think of it is like, we don't have time to be in a hurry. When we skip that process, we end up wasting so much time on the back end. Like when I have clients who talk, CLTs that want to scale up, that to me is a red flag, because yes, it's an emergent housing there's a housing crisis, but we've seen in the past what scale does. Top-down scale approaches to affordable housing you can end up, you know, with something like Pruitt-Igoe, you know, just it can be horrific, and it can be replicated at the CLT level, you know. So and in the farming sense, you know, the stuff you're asking about, soil buildup and or like improvements and all those things, those I don't know yet how those get appreciated financially. And another one thing that popped into my head when you said that is, if we do have markets for those things, are we just commodifying them, and then you know, just basically using the same broken model that we're trying to deal with now and pushing it forward, promoting it forward, so that we have carbon, you know, that carbon becomes a commodity and soil becomes a commodity, and I mean, carbon sequestration. So I don't know. I think just making sure that as a group, you are all having these conversations and that they happen over and over again. And I'm always amazed at the patience and the grace of people who can do this work. There's a CLT, actually, there's a phenomenal community land trust in Puerto Rico, and it's Caño Peña is the name, but it's like Fideicomiso Caño Peña, and they have not only housing, it's a huge space, a huge piece of land, and they are on a canal. They're always flooded. There are all kinds of environmental issues, issues of discrimination, and they have done so much community work and come up with really remarkable solutions to different problems. They continue to face problems. It is not, you know, fairyland, but it is, they are really impressive in their approach to community organizing and then community action, like actually making these things happen. And they have had legislation passed where that land was all put into the community land trust by the government. So I guess that's one group to look at.
Fabulous. Well, we have a really large bundle of resources that people have shared in the chat today. So we will assemble those when we circulate the recording so everybody has that. And if you think of stuff that you wish you had asked or that you wish you had put in the chat, just let us know. We'll add it to the bundle. We'll meet again next month. We're going to stay on this every, whatever this is, Tuesday in the month. So please feel free to keep joining us. It was really wonderful to have your wisdom shared with us, Kristin, and the collective wisdom of the group.